I'm Cristina Alger, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Cristina Alger.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Cristina Alger on the phone with me. Cristina has a brand new book that's out now. It's called The Banker's Wife, and you guys are going to love this international thriller. Welcome to the show, Cristina.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. I've been reading the book, and it is amazing, and I can't wait to talk about it. But before we can talk about it, we open the show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. It's funny. When I was little, I used to sit in the bathtub and tell my mom stories, and she would write them down in a notebook, and she still has the notebook. So she keeps it in her bedside table. So I still remember we used to call them the Bubble Lady stories, and I think that's where it all started.
The Bubble Lady stories. That's, are those ever going to see the light of day?
I sure hope not. Unless my mom wants to blackmail me in some way.
Right,
so hopefully
right.
it'll stay in her bedside drawer.
That is amazing. That's amazing. Were you a bookish kid? Did you read a lot?
I was. Oh my gosh, I was such a bookish kid. I've always been very introverted. I was a really quiet kid, and I loved to read, and so and that's continued throughout my adult life. But yeah, I started reading young, and it's always been a passion of mine.
What kinds of books did you love back then?
Well, it's funny. I started reading thrillers much earlier than I think normal children did, partly because that's what my dad read, and I, kind of wanted to do whatever he was doing. So I started with Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and that kind of thing. And then I think way too soon I was reading, whatever my dad had picked up, Tom Clancy or John Grisham or Stephen King or whatever it was. And I really tried to hang in there with him. So I started reading thrillers really young.
I love that. I always ask that because you can always see these little threads, these little hints, with those first things that really kind of capture our imagination. Those things tend to stick with us. So I love that. Did you continue writing like through high school and college? Was it something that you knew was just a part of you, or a lot of times, especially when we get to college and start thinking about life and career, sometimes that initial dream gets put on the shelf for a little while we figure out how to pay bills and raise family and stuff like that.
All that pesky stuff that gets in the way.
Yeah. The little stuff like mortgages and, stuff like that. But and I know you pursued, a different career before writing. But, was it something that stayed in the back of your mind that, one day I'm going to do this?
It's funny, it didn't. I was always a reader, and I read a lot. And when I was in college, I thought maybe I'd go and get an advanced degree in English and maybe teach. And my dad died when I was in college, and I kind of just wanted to get the highest paying job I could get. So my mom didn't have to worry about me. So that's how I ended up in finance. And I wanted to be back in New York because my family's in New York. So that I sort of, ended up in finance really because as you said, you got to pay the mortgage and, pay your rent. So I went down this path but I always kept reading, and reading was always a passion of mine. And when we hit the financial crisis, I kept thinking, God, this is like the perfect setting for a thriller. I mean, this is wild what's going on. And no one seemed to be writing about it. I mean, there's a lot of nonfiction about it, but there weren't a lot of fiction, sort of examinations of the financial crisis. And so I started writing The Darlings kind of as a passion project for fun, and I never thought it would see the light of day, and then it did. So I sort of took this left turn, and I'm so grateful that I have, because it's been really fun.
Why do you think very few people were exploring what was going on at the time in fiction?
I think a lot of writers are, the world of finance. Well, for one thing, I do feel like I hear a lot like, financial thrillers, an oxymoron. And people think finance just sounds boring or intimidating, and they're not familiar with it. And so it just tends to be overlooked a little bit. That's, you see a lot of kind of legal dramas and political dramas, but not so many set in the world of finance. So I think that's part of it. And I also think, things were happening very quickly during the financial crisis. And so it's natural for someone to try and record in a nonfiction way what was going on. But I think it took novelists a little bit more time to respond to it. So that, I think that's natural. But I still think, the world of finance is kind of underexplored and undermined territory for thrillers.
Which is kind of weird because almost everyone loves a great heist movie. And
exactly.
And when stuff happens in finance, it can definitely play out that way. And I think just maybe not enough people with inside knowledge have tried, because I would think writing a financial thriller, you could spot a fake a mile away.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that intimidates people, the sense that you have to be authentic, and do you really understand what you're writing about? And it does take some research, but that was the good news about my background, is that I have a little bit of background, enough to, I think, hopefully write articulately about the topic.
So talk about your background just a little bit. You went to college. You wanted to find the best way to take care of yourself. Why finance and law? Why did you land there?
So as I said, I was an English major. I'm a terrible math student. I always have been. And I thought I would maybe go be a paralegal at a law firm. I wanted to get a job in New York so I could be close to my mom, and a job that paid well right out of college, which is a rarity. And there was a drop box for Goldman Sachs resumes right outside my door, my college dorm. And they paid more money to be in the legal department at Goldman Sachs than law firms were paying. And so I said, done, sold. So that's how I ended up at Goldman Sachs. And then ultimately, when I went to law school, because I had worked at Goldman Sachs, all the law firms wanted to hire me into their corporate groups because I had a little bit of financial background. So it just sort of, turned into this, decade where I spent this decade in finance having really no reason to be there other than, I initially wanted to make money out of college. But it's fun. I learned a lot. And, finance can be fascinating, and it's very high stakes, and you meet a lot of smart people. And so I don't regret it.
Nice. You mentioned that, you are watching this kind of total chaos unfold and wondering why people are not exploring this. I think a lot of people wonder those things, and then it takes that special person to actually sit down and say, okay, how can I do this? So where was the Darlings born in all of this?
The Darlings was really born, because I was living in New York City at the time, and I was working at a law firm. I still remember the day we had a firm-wide meeting where the heads of the firm called every single lawyer into a conference room and said, Lehman Brothers just declared bankruptcy, and we don't know what's going to happen now. And this is sort of an all-hands-on-deck situation. And it was really scary. I felt like I was living history, and you could see the sort of fear on the face of the senior lawyers, and that was sort of alarming as a junior associate. And while my job was secure because I had some bankruptcy experience, my friends were losing jobs left and right. It felt like the economy was in free fall. And so I think I actually started writing it because I wanted to understand what was going on and capture the sort of odd moment in time. And so The Darlings takes place over a week. It happens over the Thanksgiving week, and it focuses on one family that's very deeply and profoundly affected by the financial crisis. And so to me, that was sort of a way of, I guess as a catharsis, it was sort of writing about what I was experiencing at that time and what the city around me was going through.
Had you ever tackled, something that big? I would imagine that through college and being an English major, you had written pieces before, but, this was destined to be,
never.
A breakout novel.
Never did. I had not tried a novel before. So I'd written a lot of bad poetry and a bunch of short stories. And this, I thought it was going to be a short story, and I didn't even know why I was writing it, to be honest. It was just for my own entertainment. But it just sort of kept growing. And then, I had a novel in front of me. So.
And then did you shop that out to agents, and kind of what was that story there?
It's such a wild story. So one of my best friends from college was a writer. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and she and I were on the literary magazine together, and she had become a novelist, and she always encouraged me to write. She's wonderful. She worked for the New Yorker for some time. And so every time she'd come to New York, we get together and she'd say, why are you working in finance? What are you doing with your life? You should be in publishing. You love to read. You love to write. And so I had coffee with her, and we were having our usual coffee in which she asked me what I was doing with my life. And I said, actually, I am working on something. I wrote this novel. And she said, well, send it to me. She was flying between London and California. She said, I had this really long flight. Just send it to me and I'll read it. So I sent it to her. I don't hear from her for a couple days, of course, and I didn't expect to. But the next day my phone rings, and it's her agent at this literary agency, and she introduces herself and said, Sarah, your friend, said you would never send this to an agent, so she sent it to me for you, and I like it. So are you interested in having lunch? And I said, sure. I had no idea what an agent did at the time. So that is how I found my agent, and it happened in a very roundabout way. And I'm very grateful to my friend who sort of pushed me into sending this out.
So that book comes out, and then you follow that up with This Was Not the Plan, which is kind of a departure from that first book.
It was. So I wrote The Darlings, and then The Darlings was picked up by HBO, and it never went anywhere, but I spent some time working on the screenplay for that. And I was supposed to write another financial thriller, and then I ended up getting pregnant with my daughter, and I had a crazy pregnancy, and there were a lot of complications with her in her first year, and she's healthy and very chatty now. But it was sort of a time where I needed to step back and, really focus on our family life. And I really missed writing, but I was so bogged down in being a parent that I didn't know how to create time to even, take a shower, much less write a book. And so I had this crazy idea of writing a comedy about a single dad who's raising a little boy on his own. And it kind of came to me, late one night when I had not had enough sleep. And I wrote it really quickly, and I sent it to my agent. I said, I know this is not what my editor is looking for, but it's kind of what I'm going through right now. So that's how that book was born.
That's awesome. Did your editor, kind of wonder what in the heck is Cristina, doing, sending me this? But that book was very well received. I think she knew what I was doing.
Yeah. I think she knew what I was doing. I was losing my mind. I think so. That book was very raw for me. I mean, it's about a parent really trying to figure out how to be a parent, how to be a working parent, and really struggling with balancing those two things. So I put a lot of myself in it, and I think she knew what was going on with me at that time.
Well, that brings us up to The Banker's Wife, which is your new release, out now, which brings us back to that fertile territory of your first book. Where did this book come from, and tell us a little bit of the setup for it.
So this book really came out of, I've had this sort of ongoing fascination with offshore banking for a long time. I just felt like it's really underexplored, and it's so mysterious and sort of a great setting for a thriller. And, a few years ago, the Panama Papers case broke out where there was a data leak out of an offshore law firm. And I just said, someone should be writing about this. I mean, this is crazy. And going up into the election when there was so much speculation about, was there Russian interference? And I kept thinking, why isn't someone looking into, offshore banking records? And so I started writing this book, and I think it actually has proved to be pretty timely, and sort of, it feels kind of ripped from the headlines, even though I started writing it a couple of years ago.
When you're beginning to write a story like this, and you're kind of beginning to maybe feel out all the set pieces that go with it, do you ever remember back to some of those books that you got from your dad, like because this has a lot of Tom Clancy set up? Do you pull from those early memories?
For sure. I mean, I think I've always said to people, I think the best way to learn how to write is to read. And so, I think if you go back and I think I've read The Firm maybe 10 times. I mean, it's such a classic book. It's so well done. And I think, when you read those classics again and again, you see the same things that really grip you. And one of them is that you keep the pace moving forward. And also that you really try and hook the reader by showing and not telling, and not getting too bogged down in sort of, internal monologue or, I think that's sort of what the masters of thriller writing do. And they sort of tell you who the character is without sort of talking at you. And that's, I tried to go back to that and remember what I loved about those books when I was writing this book.
This book not only deals with, financial intrigue, if you will, and the inner workings of banks and law firms and that sort of thing. But you also have international politics, and not just politics, but kind of the things that people fear of, these shadowy people that really kind of control things behind the scenes. Where did that element come from for you?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I think it's real.
Which is double scary.
It's double scary. And, I think when I was writing this book, it was leading up into the election. As I said, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not there was Russian interference into our election, which is obviously kind of terrifying. And when the Panama Papers came out, it showed that there were a lot of relationships between world leaders that were being conducted in offshore accounts that no one knew about. And I thought that was such a terrifying concept that no one, I felt, wasn't being talked about enough. So that's, kind of, that overhangs the banker's wife, right? That there's this kind of global, very powerful elite that, don't operate by the same rules as everyone else.
You've got this really powerful character in Marina, and she is. Tell us about her. Where did she come from for you?
So Marina, I've kind of grown up with Marina. So Marina was a minor character in The Darlings, and she was a young, sort of hungry society journalist in The Darlings, and she breaks the story about this hedge fund that's collapsing. And, I was in my 20s when I wrote that book, and Marina was in her 20s, and now, 10 years later, Marina's a much more senior journalist, and she's seasoned, and she's known for sort of breaking these hard-hitting stories. And so she digs into this story about Swiss United, this bank that this private banker worked for. And that's where she came from. And I love her. I think she's a great character. I think she's sort of tough and feisty, and she's not perfect, but you kind of root for her the whole way.
Well, and Marina gets herself into a situation that is because she has to she comes to a decision point where is she going to go for the thing that she's always dreamed about, or is she going to stick by her journalistic integrity and do the thing that is going to be hard? But can you talk a little bit about that storyline and the tension in that?
So she, she's digging into this story. It's this, she sort of knows it's the story of her career, and it's the story that her mentor is Duncan Sander, who's also in The Darlings, and he's been murdered. So he's been murdered over this story. She is sort of desperate to solve it and to put it out there. And she knows that it'll sort of make her as a journalist. But if she puts it out there, it will destroy the lives of people that she's very close to. And so she goes through, a real internal struggle about whether or not to publish this story. And I think, I think especially right now when there's so much discussion about kind of fake news and, journalists and journalistic integrity, I thought it was really interesting to have a journalist sort of going through this struggle of, she spent her whole career dedicated to getting the truth out there, and then here's her opportunity, and does she do it at the expense of her loved ones?
I'm always fascinated to when an author brings out a book that is so timely and is just really resonating with people, and then to think that like you mentioned earlier, that this book is really about 2 years old in the writing, because if you're publishing with a big publishing house, you're going to write the book, then go through months of revisions, and then there's all the publicity that leads up, and the book is about 2 years old when it comes out. And I'm always amazed at how writers are able to tap in to, this subconscious thing that's going on in society and bring out a story that just resonates so deeply at just the right time. Does it ever kind of freak you out a little bit that you see things coming?
I think, for me, it's always if I feel like this is so fascinating and this is scary and this is really happening right now, I sort of have to assume other people are feeling that way also. So I've really tried to listen to those instincts in myself. Why am I so obsessed with the Panama Papers? Why is this interesting me, right now? And I think if I do that, hopefully it finds an audience. But this has been particularly scary because I wrote this, I guess I was finishing it up a year ago, so last summer, but when I started writing it, the election hadn't happened yet, and this sort of really intense tension between the White House in particular and journalists and sort of the tension over political journalism has heightened so tremendously in the last year. And so I think the book feels more relevant than ever. But I mean, I never could have seen that coming. So it's been a little bit alarming to see, some of the things in this book kind of actually come to fruition. But, it's fun too, because it means I think the book is relevant and hopefully people will want to read it.
Let's talk about craft for just a minute. The Banker's Wife has been praised a lot for its breakneck speed, and you've really put out a page turner. You grab the reader from that first chapter, and you're like, oh my God, what is going on here? And you just you keep feeding us just enough information to make us keep turning the pages. Are you a detailed plotter, or are you figuring out the story as you write?
So, with this one, I actually did plot it out. I historically have not been a plotter, and it's been my downfall because it takes me forever to write books, and I end up getting frustrated and throwing away a lot of my writing. And so this time, especially because I knew where I wanted to begin and where I wanted to end, I was like, okay, this time I'm doing it. I'm sitting down and I'm plotting it out. And it was a little bit painful because I love the writing part of it. So I want to jump ahead into the writing as soon as I can. But I was actually really grateful that I plotted it out first because it allowed me to kind of execute all the little twists and turns without, having to go back and reinvent the wheel.
Well, on the, when it's all finished, I'm sure you were like, oh, I'm so glad I did that. But during the writing, did having the detailed outline and knowing all the twists and turns, did that help the writing to stay fresh for you, or did it feel like a little bit like, oh, I know this story already? Like, what is that? What does the in the trenches feel like?
So, what I did was I basically had the kind of, I guess, plot points, the beats of the story rather, written down, and then I had to sort of get myself from point A to point B. So, the writing itself felt fresh because I was like, okay, how do we get this done? How do we get Marina to get all this data? Where is it coming from? And so I still had to, get myself there. But I had kind of the outline or the sort of skeleton of the story in front of me, which was sort of reassuring. And I also, I think as your story progresses, I just became, my characters sort of came to life and they had their own personalities. And, so sometimes you have to be a little bit flexible and, go with where you think your character would go.
Yeah, I think people misunderstand sometimes when you talk about having a detailed outline, they feel like, well, this is just going to, read like cardboard, because it's just, planned to death. But that really is the way to do it, is, to have a roadmap, but then allow your characters to find their way between the story beats, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's the joy of being a writer, is you get to, these people become real people to you, and you get to sort of watch them come to life, and they don't always cooperate. So that's kind of fun.
So the new book, The Banker's Wife, it's out now. This is going to be a real barn burner. I'm about 3/4 of the way through the book. I got it the other day, and it is just amazing. I cannot wait to get to the end of it. I'm going to finish it today. But what are you working on now, Cristina?
So I am working on another thriller. It's not a financial thriller. It's just a traditional thriller about a series of interconnected murders that take place on Long Island, which I spent a lot of time out there, and it's one of my favorite places. And so it's kind of dark and fun, and I'm hoping it'll be out in the next year or so.
Strong Island. I love it. Cristina, if people are just discovering you for the first time and want to know more about you and your back catalog and follow along with you, where can they find you online?
So I am just CristinaAlger.com. It's Cristina with no H. And I'm on all kinds of social media, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. So you can find me around the web, and The Banker's Wife is out now, and it's, out wherever books are sold. So thank you.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you and to pick up a copy of The Banker's Wife. Thanks so much for taking time to come on the show today, Cristina.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final, if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle. No, rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought, and then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise headless and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily, the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.